Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about Xenophanes and Plato's natural theology. So let us begin. Xenophanes is an early thinker. He's one of the very early philosophers. His dates are 5070 to 4078 BC, before Christ, before the Common Era. And the main background for his philosophical theological thinking are the Homeric poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And in those poems, the description of the gods, it's like humans writ large. Gods are like humans; they have human bodies, or at least they can put on human bodies. They have emotions that are driving them. The motivation for action many times is grounded in emotions, and sometimes vicious emotions. They have, vicious character sometimes. The main distinction between humans and the gods of the Homeric poems is that the gods of the Homeric poems are more powerful and are immortal, at least in some sense of immortal. So they're really like humans, but stronger, and they can live for longer. But crucially, they're subject to the same emotions and vices, and that kind of description is really going to bother a lot of the philosophers, and it's going to bother Xenophine. So Xenophine criticized those conceptions of the gods as nothing more than childish anthropomorphisms. In other words, they're like projections of the human drama onto divinity. They are clothing in human garment things that are divine and not quite human. So, like these pictures here illustrate as well. You have the one picture of wind, right? There's a natural force. And the picture has, if you look carefully, there's a face and it has hair, right? So there's this personality that has to do with wind, or the other picture in which we have the sun that is shining on the person. It has a face and is smiling, right? It's treating the person well, right? It's intending to do something, right? So these drawings put forth a anthropomorphization of the natural forces, and that's a lot of what's happening in the Homeric poems. There is this endowing with personality some of the natural forces and calling those gods, and then thinking of those personalities in pretty much in human kind of terms. They have bodies like us, or can take bodies like us. They have emotions, have eyes, and so on. And Xenophine is going to think that's a serious kind of fallacy of thinking. It is foolish to go from we are humans, therefore other things are like us. The laws of nature, the gods are like us, like humans. And here's a cool quote, the Xenophine's one of the extant quotes that we have from him. Quote, if cows and horses or lions had hands and could draw, then horses would draw the forms of gods like horses, cows like cows, making their bodies similar in shape to their own. So that's another way of saying that the problem with a lot of these stories, this Homeric conception of the gods, is that it's just a human projection, right? It is humans making gods in their own image, not the reverse. It is those pictures of gods that we see there are nothing but like human activities. And Xenophanes thinks that's a little childish, that's a little premature, that there's something deficient in those conceptions of the gods. So he offers a more sophisticated monotheism. Here's another quote that we have that's remained from him. He thinks there is one God, which is Lord over the other gods, the smaller gods, the angel like beings, and humankind. And this God is not like like mortals, like humans, in either body or in mind. The way it thinks, if it thinks at all, it's not the kind of thing that we do, right? We are confined to our bodies in different sorts of ways. And the God, the one God, is not. So it is a mistake to these anthropomorphizations, these projections of humanity onto divinity. We shouldn't do that because God is different. He's divine. He's not human. Um, and he builds a little bit of a natural theology. That is, he builds a little bit of a conception of the nature of God in the relationship to us. And some of the things he says are the following. So, human reason comprehends God as the most powerful of all things, right? So we can use the reason and grasp what God is, and what God is the most perfect of all beings, right? That's not the result of revelation. That's just a reason thinking about the nature of God, and we can know that much. To be God is to be the most perfect of all things, and some things follow from this list logically. Just thinking. there can be only one true God. For if there were more than one God, then none of them would be more powerful than the other, and therefore there wouldn't be a most powerful of all things. Um, if there is the most powerful beings that we know of, we might call that being God. But then if it turns out there's another one that is bigger than, more powerful than that one, then it's really the other one that is God, not the one we know, right? So to be God is to be the most powerful of them all. And Xenophanes is pointing out that means there cannot be more than one, because if they're equal, then there is no one that is more than all. And here's another kind of cool consequence that Xenophanes thinks follows from this. God must have always existed, for nothing can create itself, so God didn't create himself. Nothing can be created by lesser beings, so like humans or lesser, like angel, like God, small g gods couldn't have created God, right? There is nothing in the universe that could create the most powerful of all beings, because no one can create something that's greater than themselves. That's a basic principle of reality. Things Xenophine and other philosophers are going to agree. Um, and because there are no equals in greater than God, there is no greater being that can create God, or equal amount of gods that can come together and together create God, right? So there's just no being in reality with the power to create God. So if God exists, he must always exist. Why? Because there is nothing that is powerful enough to create it. And of course, Xenophanes thinks that God exists, so he thinks God always exists, necessarily exists, and that follows from our grasp and the nature of God as the most powerful of all things there is. So we don't need to assess too much this theology. For the main purposes for our class is to assess Xenophanes' methodology. It is the methodology that places him as one of the forefathers of philosophy, because his way of approaching topics of the divine, the nature of God, is not to appeal to reveal text or oracles or divination strategies in order to assess God's existence and nature. He's not trying to do any of those things, right? He's not doing the typical like calling for God for inspiration for the making of a poem like other ancient writers did. He's not appealing to God's special inspiration. He's not doing some of these other devices like appealing to reveal text or articles and so on. Right? He's not doing these other means for trying to understand the nature of God. He's just relying on human reason and evidence, and that's really what we mean by natural theologies and Xenophanes. It's the strategy of thinking about God and whether God exists, the nature of God, the relationship of God to humanity and the world, and so on, using reason and evidence alone. To do that is to engage in natural theology. And that's kind of a lot of the things that philosophers do. And this goes all the way back to Xenophanes as a particular methodology for dealing with the divine. So Plato is in that tradition. Plato is a proponent of natural theology. He uses reason to think about the divine. He doesn't appeal to other more kind of traditional religious practices like divination and so on. He's using his reason. And here are some of the like consequences, or here some of the conclusions of Plato's thinking about natural theology. So during Plato's middle period, that is the period in which he wrote the Phaedo and the Republic, the main kind of player in his theory is what he calls the form of the good. And the form of the good is a godlike, or at least plays a godlike role in his thinking. Everything in the world that is good precisely by participating in the form of the good itself. There's a sense in which everything in the world that is good strives to imitate, right? They try to be like the form of good, the good itself. And everything that it has existence or being is good to the extent that has existence and being. So everything in reality is kind of structured by imitating and participating and striving to be like the one form of good. So there's a sense in which the form of the good illuminates or makes intelligible everything to the extent that those things are intelligible, right? So it plays a fundamental role in his ontology. And Plato himself appeals to the sun as an analogy. Like this painting, for example, there's the heart of it, which is the sun, and the rays of the sun illuminate everything else. The way Plato thinks about it, the form of good is intelligibility itself. It's a thing that is capable of being known and made good. In everything else, it's intelligible, it's knowable to the extent that it is good, because good and existence and being are kind of intertwined. So everything that is knowable, that exists, it exists to the extent that it resembles, so that participates in the good, and the good kind of illuminates that, it makes everything intelligible, makes everything capable of being known. So that's kind of the deep, basic conception of Platonic ontology, Platonic way of thinking about the world. Also, in the middle period, he wrote the Symposium, a famous work on love and beauty. And there is really the form of beauty itself, another form, another universal, essential being that is not in space and time. And it is the form of beauty that plays a godlike role. And the godlike role is to be the object of contemplation as the greatest activity of the mind, grasping the most fundamental aspects of reality. So, uh, contemplation becomes like the activity distinctive of soul that enables or that tries to transcend the grasping of the beautiful things. So beautiful things in the world are beautiful because they're attractive, right? They're the objects of desire. We strive to attain them. We strive to know them. We strive to be in union with those things because they're beautiful. It is their beauty that draws us. It is their beauty that attracts us. And what it is to contemplate beauty itself, thinks Plato, is to begin by contemplating the beauty of the particulars, so the things that are beautiful to some extent, the things in the world of change and the world of becoming, and to see through them because they point to this higher reality, which is beauty itself. So you begin with the being attracted to the beautiful things, and through them you point to the ground of them all, which is beauty itself, which is a form of beauty. And there's this kind of journey of going up to the final stage of life, which is contemplation. Contemplation is of beauty itself, the ground that makes everything beautiful and thereby worthy of being pursued, or that which is attractive. So the beauty and the good play very similar roles in this early period in Plato's thinking. Crucially for our purposes, the kind of final picture of the happy philosopher, the one that finally contemplates beauty or finally contemplates the form of the good, is a kind of purely intellectual picture. There is this object, the perfect object of understanding, which is beauty, which is goodness. And then the philosopher fully grasps it. And through it, the philosopher grasps everything else because it, the form of goodness or beauty, make everything else intelligible. So that's the final picture of contemplation. Crucially, that those forms, the form of good and beauty, are not personal. It's not like a relationship. It's not that like it looks back. It's not like the kind of personal God that most other religions have. It's just the kind of form that makes everything intelligible. So there's somewhat kind of detached, not personal relationships. Um, Kind of way of relating to fundamental reality, which is the form of the good or the beautiful. Uh, Plato changed his mind, though, as he got older. His natural theology formed and became much more mainstream monotheism. So, by his mature thinking, Plato had reached a more mainstream conception of monotheism, one in which God is personal, alive, and with a mind, capable of entering into love relationships with people. And it is that God that starts becoming the proper object of contemplation, the proper object of kind of final union or communion with at the end of life, in the afterlife, for Plato. So, in other words, a much more traditional monotheistic conception uh, of God in the final stage of human happiness. So, in the Timaeus, a later work by Plato, God is presented as the creator of the physical universe. God creates the immortal soul, the part of the humans that is the best part. And then God also creates other invisible entities, other godlike entities or like angel-like entities. And those are the ones that create the lesser matter, and united with the soul that God himself created and so on. And the thought is that God creates the most impressive things in the world, and the human soul is one of the more impressive things. That is the lesser gods, the less impressive gods that also God creates, that they create matter and unify it in the right kind of way for it to give rise to physical reality. So this looks a lot more like mainstream or traditional monotheism. In the different work, The Laws, Plato also placed a huge emphasis on the role that religion has to play in the good society. He thought that good citizens must believe in the gods. In other words, that atheism should be outlawed. If you're an atheist, you can be punished, you will be punished by the law, Plato thought. And his assumption was that to believe in God was to believe in goodness, and to believe in goodness was to be a good citizen. There was this deep connection, he thinks, in his mind between being a believer, believing in God, and being a good citizen, playing by the rules and bringing about a good society. But that's not the only belief that people should have in a good society. Plato thinks that you must also believe not just that God exists, but that God is interested in the affairs of humans, that God is intertwined. He cares about what happens to humans. And furthermore, crucially, the God cannot be bribed by prayers or sacrifices. God is not the kind of being that you can offend by doing a sinful behavior, but then make things right by going and making an offering, and then like God will be happy. Like, okay, fair enough. Give me something, I'll forgive you. Right? It's not a being that can be bribed or can be engaged in this kind of mercantile transaction. Uh, God and the gods are good. So what they demand, what God demands, is morality, to be a good person, to grow and flourish as an individual, not offerings that are more like bribes. Um, Plato thinks that the gods would reward virtue and punish vice, either in this life or in the next. So, belief in God grounds the belief in morality in an important way, and crucially, it grounds the belief that virtue is correlated with eternal bliss, and vice is correlated with something bad. And the gods become the virtue, the bridges for believing those things. So Plato's final conception of natural theology and the basis of reason looks a lot like the more traditional monotheistic religious perspectives. Okay, let's end there. See you next time. Bye.